Hi, my name is Paul Sargent, and today we're going to take a look at the second part of our lecture on the Constitution. This is the Articles of Confederation, our little-known but yet important government. Now, in order to understand, like last time we talked a lot about the Declaration of Independence, the ideas of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and it's important to understand the colonial mindset after the Declaration of Independence. Generally speaking, people believed in some sort of a higher law and that there was natural law out there. And there's a real belief in the mind that the war was ideological, not economical. In other words, they're fighting for freedom because really to rally people behind like less taxes is tough. I mean, good to do for politics, but not great to do for a war. And also they believe legitimate government, it had to do with the consent of the governed, and that they were looking for a written constitution, which Britain didn't have. In other words, there had to be something written down, which definitely limited the powers of the government. They believed government must respect liberty as a very important piece of the puzzle, and they believed that the legislative branch that makes the laws had to be superior to the executive because they were really worried of the return of a king and a very strong executive who could like overpower the legislative branch, and they didn't want that, and so they wanted a strong legislative. Now, the states under the Articles of Confederation all sort of underwent some changes. There's more democracy that goes on, more people able to vote. As long as you were a white male, read that very carefully, there was largely liberty. And you have more political participation. So in other words, more people are becoming part of the political process, which is a trend that we see throughout American history. Whenever there's a crisis or a war or something like that, people tend to care what's going on in politics more often. And power is coming along with the middle class, these being artisans and professionals who are really starting to exert their power now that they're no longer under the British regime, which had a lot to do with heredity and nobility and all that kind of stuff. But the majority of people in the states were farmers and craftsmen, and especially people who are moving out to the frontier are going to start to try to exercise their power. This colonial elite, which had been kind of like in charge of the whole place for a long time, they saw this power fading to the middle class and to the farmers and to the craftsmen who are starting because of more democracy to have more power, and they were not happy because of this, and so they were looking for some sort of solution. Well, they write different state constitutions, and here are just a couple examples. Pennsylvania has a very democratic system with annual elections. I mean, talk about term limits. Let's make someone be reelected every single year. There was a term limit of 4 years on anything. There's no governor or president. There's only this executive council, okay, which means that there's no executive in order to sort of carry it out. They disenfranchised the Quakers, they ignored the jury trial, and they persecuted conscientious objectors, people who opposed the war. It was strong government, but of course you have this problem that it tramples rights, and when people's rights are trampled, they get a little bit unhappy. In Massachusetts, you had to be Christian to serve, so they're putting religious qualifications here. Very clear separation of power, including the veto power there, and life terms for judges, which is going to be something that they're going to incorporate in the Constitution. In order to vote, you had to have a certain amount of property, and £1,000 at the time was a lot of money. I'm not going to worry about like modern day equivalencies and stuff like that because that's really an imperfect science, but it was a lot of money. It protected rights, but the government was weak, so it didn't have that. And basically you can say that there were some similarities: popular sovereignty, limited government, and there had lots of protections for civil rights and liberties. And in fact, 7 had the Bill of Rights, which would lead to like a lack of the Bill of Rights when they go to write the actual Constitution, because they say, hey, you know, the states have them, so why should we worry about it? Well, the government that they create is called the Articles of Confederation. This is something that not a lot of Americans know about, but it is on the AP exam. So in 1781, this thing goes along, and a confederation is kind of this situation where you have a central power that has no power, okay? And local governments that exist, counties, for example, have all of the power in them, and they go through and they give power to the central government. Now, in this situation, these local governments are states, and that central power is the Continental Congress. And so all the power is here. And the Continental Congress does not have any authority over these different states. It's just a league of friendship that goes on. So every colony has its own sovereignty. It has its own independence. It's like its own country. And in the Congress, each state had one vote, total equality. Basic things, they could make peace, they could ratify treaties, they ran the army, which is a good thing for a country to do. The post office is good, and they could coin money, however, it was like worthless, basically, because every state was also able to create its own money, and so who would accept these continentals as they became? And here's how it kind of divided it out, okay? So here's the national government right here, and they have these powers: declare war, negotiate treaties, manage foreign affairs, print money, establish a postal system, establish a military. But it's limited because, and these are important, there's no power to enforce laws, there's no national court system, so if states have issues with one another, there's nothing to get in the way. There's no power to tax, so you can't pay for anything. And there's no power to regulate trade or put tariffs on foreign goods to collect taxes that way. It's structured like this. There's one branch of government. It's the Congress, and each state had one vote. So that's basically it. This is not good because while they can do all of these things over here, this really hinders their ability to do anything, and any state could choose not to be a part of whatever they decided on. All right, so there's lots of problems. Now, this is a pretty complicated graphic here, but let's walk through it really quickly. Running the government, obviously, no power to enforce national laws. You have to have 9 states to agree, so this is not difficult, right? There's not easy right here. And any change had to have all 13 of the states agree on it. And the states themselves have problems. They have what amount to international problems because they're all kind of their own countries. They were in debt, and they needed to raise taxes to pay off these debts. There were some border disputes, which almost led to war. Some states placed tariffs on goods from other states, Pennsylvania charges Delaware a tariff. There's no national court system to solve all this. And Congress doesn't have the power. Oh, sorry, we're getting into the economic problems here of the Articles of Confederation. Huge national debt, but you can't tax. That's a problem. The Continental Congress was broke. They couldn't tax. And here it is, this voluntary donation. States could voluntarily donate. And they printed paper money, which was worthless. Absolutely. Hey. Now, the problem is then, so businesses wouldn't accept the continental money, and states would not accept it to pay taxes. So basically, if you were a Revolutionary War soldier and you got paid in continentals, then you couldn't pay any of your taxes with it and any of that. So after the war, you have this depression that comes along, which is not uncommon after wars. But because of the depression, they have a lot of farmers that are just unable to pay their debts whatsoever. That thing just swung around on me. So they're unable to pay their debts. And as they're unable to pay their debts, that leads to this little thing called foreclosure. Now, foreclosure means they take their farms away. But state legislatures are being elected by people who are more middle class, so they tend to be more sympathetic to the creditors, the people who are doing the banking and all of that. There are some states, though, that favored the debtors, those people who actually owed the money. And so they just reacted by printing lots of paper money, and they said, hey, creditors, you have to accept it. Now, this is the problem when you've got renegade states doing their own thing. They just can come up with bad ideas. Well, this man, Captain Daniel Shay, becomes the leader of a movement that is going to trigger something that really happens. And what happens is they decide that violence is the answer. You have these people whose farms are being foreclosed, and if the tax collector or the judge comes around, you just attack him. and then that can't do his job. When the court goes to meet to foreclose farms, you band together outside of it with armed forces and say, come on in, try it. And now all of a sudden we have vigilante justice. Well, it gets so bad that they actually march on Boston, and the Bostonians get really worried. So what do? They say, hey, we need to bring in the army. But the army's been disbanded, and the Confederation Congress doesn't have the ability to raise an army, nor do they have the funds or the people. They certainly can't get soldiers from Georgia up to Massachusetts in time to stop this. It's a mess. Well, they end up finding basically mercenary soldiers, and they do end the rebellion here in February 27th of 1787. Now, in light of this, Thomas Jefferson actually saw this as a good thing. Writing from Paris, this would be what I call, as a history teacher, foreshadowing, because he writes this in 1787. And if you know anything about Paris and 1789, maybe you just, yeah. And if not, look it up. Anyway, he said, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. We should be happy. God forbid that we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Kind of an interesting look at things. We need to every 20 years. Well, some people decide to meet in Annapolis to talk about the problem. It's a small group of leaders. Really, there's just conflicts, commercial being the big thing, trade, but there were only 5 states there. And so those 5 states, they said, hey, let's make a big meeting, all right? Let's meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, or the late spring at that point, and let's figure this whole thing out. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we get the Constitutional Convention. So that brings us to the end of this. I mean, that's the Articles of Confederation, a weak government that we had, which not only set the stage for the United States of America, but by proving its weakness, set the foundation for a meeting in Philadelphia that would write the U.S. Constitution that still we use today. So, hey, thanks for watching. I hope this has helped. And as always, my name's Paul Sargent, and you guys have a good day.